Hello everyone, if you enjoy my channel, please support me with one like, one subscribe, and one share.
The words escaped. Have you ever said something in anger that made your own heart stop? What if one sentence could almost destroy the family you spent years building? Today, I want to share the most painful moment of my life in the United States. I looked into my husband's eyes and quietly said, "I want a divorce." But the real question is this: did I truly mean those words? Stay with me until the end because this story completely changed the way I understand love, marriage, family, and even myself. If you are learning English, listen slowly, read carefully, and let this story become part of your own journey. My name is Emma, and I have lived in the United States for many years. From the outside, my life looked almost perfect. We owned a comfortable home in a peaceful neighborhood. Every Saturday morning, I watched my children ride their bicycles while neighbors smiled and waved as they walked their dogs. We celebrated birthdays together, decorated the house for Christmas, and took family road trips every summer. Anyone looking through our family photos would probably think we were one of the happiest families in America. The truth, however, was hidden behind those smiling pictures. Happiness can disappear very quietly. It rarely announces itself before leaving. According to relationship researchers, many couples experience emotional distance long before they ever consider divorce. The problem is not usually one dramatic fight. It is often hundreds of tiny disappointments that slowly pile up until two people no longer recognize each other. Looking back, I realized that was happening to us. Every morning felt exactly the same. My husband left early for work. I rushed to prepare breakfast, packed lunches for the children, cleaned the kitchen, answered work emails, picked up groceries, cooked dinner, helped with homework, and somehow tried to smile through my exhaustion. We lived under the same roof, but sometimes it felt as if we lived on different planets. We spoke mostly about schedules, bills, appointments, and the children's activities. We rarely spoke about our feelings anymore. Maybe you know that feeling. You are surrounded by people you love, but somehow you still feel lonely. It is one of the strangest kinds of loneliness because nobody else can see it. I kept telling myself everything was normal. Marriage is hard. Parenting is hard. Life in America is busy. Everyone says that. So I ignored the growing silence between us. My husband probably believed everything was fine too. Neither of us realized that silence can slowly become a wall. One rainy Thursday evening changed everything. Traffic was terrible. Dinner was late. The children were arguing over homework. I had been awake since before sunrise, and every small problem felt twice as heavy. My husband walked through the front door, looked around the messy kitchen, and casually asked, "What's for dinner?" He did not say anything cruel. It was an ordinary question. But to me, it sounded like the final drop that made an already full glass overflow. Something inside me finally broke. I turned toward him, looked directly into his eyes, and heard my own voice say words I never imagined I would speak. I want a divorce. The room became completely silent. Even the children stopped talking. My husband stared at me as if he had never seen me before. His face showed confusion more than anger. He opened his mouth but said nothing. For a few seconds, nobody moved. I could hear the rain hitting the windows and my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. That moment lasted only seconds, but it felt like an entire lifetime. The strange part was that as soon as I spoke those words, I became afraid of them. Did I really want to end our marriage? Or was I simply begging for someone to notice how tired, invisible, and emotionally empty I had become? Scientists who study emotions explain that during periods of intense stress, the emotional center of the brain can temporarily overpower logical thinking. When that happens, people often say things that reflect overwhelming pain rather than their deepest desires. At that moment, I did not know any psychology. I only knew that I felt broken. My husband quietly picked up his car keys, walked outside into the rain, and drove away without saying a single word. I stood alone in the kitchen wondering whether I had just destroyed the most important relationship of my life. I did not know that this painful sentence would become the beginning of a journey that would completely transform our marriage, our family, and the way I understood love forever. Perhaps the biggest mistake is not saying, "I want a divorce." Perhaps the biggest mistake is waiting so long that those words become the only ones left to say. Silence at home. Have you ever noticed that the loudest sound in a house is sometimes complete silence? After my husband drove away that rainy evening, the quiet inside our home felt heavier than any argument we had ever had. The clock kept ticking. The rain kept falling. My children quietly walked upstairs without asking a single question. I stood alone in the kitchen staring at the dinner that nobody wanted to eat. Just 1 hour earlier, we had looked like an ordinary American family. Now it felt as if our entire future had disappeared with the sound of a closing front door. I wanted to call my husband immediately and apologize, but something inside me refused to move. Pride can be surprisingly powerful. Every time I closed my eyes, I replayed the moment when I said, "I want a divorce." I wondered whether those 5 words had already become permanent. Relationship experts often explain that during serious conflict, couples naturally enter what psychologists call emotional withdrawal. Instead of solving problems together, both people begin protecting themselves from more pain. Looking back, that description fit us perfectly. My husband returned home after midnight. I heard the garage door open, then slow footsteps entering the house. He did not come into our bedroom. Instead, he quietly slept on the couch downstairs. The next morning, everything looked normal on the outside. Coffee was made. The children ate breakfast. School bags were packed. My husband simply said, "Have a good day," before leaving for work. His voice was calm, almost too calm. That frightened me more than shouting ever could. For the next several days, our conversations became painfully short. Did you pay the electric bill? What time is soccer practice? Can you pick up milk? We spoke like co-workers managing a project instead of 2 people who once promised to love each other forever. The silence slowly spread through the house like cold winter air. Even our children sensed that something was wrong. My youngest daughter stopped telling funny stories during dinner. My son spent more time in his room, wearing headphones. Children often notice emotional changes long before adults realize it. They may not understand the words, but they always feel the atmosphere. One evening, while folding laundry, I found a family photo taken 2 years earlier during a summer vacation in Yellowstone National Park. We were all smiling. My husband had his arm around my shoulders. The children were laughing because a squirrel had stolen part of our picnic. I stared at that picture for a long time and asked myself one painful question. Where did those people go? The truth was uncomfortable. We had not stopped loving each other overnight. We had simply stopped noticing each other. Studies suggest that healthy couples continue making small emotional connections every day. A smile, a thank you, a simple touch on the shoulder, a few minutes of real conversation without phones. Those tiny moments act like small deposits into an emotional bank account. We had been making withdrawals for years without adding anything back. One Saturday morning, I watched my neighbors across the street planting flowers together. They laughed because one of the pots accidentally tipped over. Watching them made me unexpectedly emotional. I realized I could not remember the last time my husband and I laughed together without talking about responsibilities. Life in America moves quickly. Work deadlines, mortgage payments, children's schedules, grocery shopping, insurance forms. Endless emails. Sometimes it feels as if every day becomes a race against the clock. Somewhere inside that race, our marriage quietly became another task on a never-ending to-do list instead of the relationship that held our family together. Then something happened that I did not expect. My daughter came into the kitchen carrying a drawing she had made at school. It showed our family standing in front of our house under a bright blue sky. But there was one detail I could not ignore. My father was standing on one side of the page. I was standing on the other. The children were drawn between us. Asked her gently, "Why are mommy and daddy so far apart?" She looked at me with innocent eyes and answered, "Because you don't smile at each other anymore." Children rarely use complicated words. They simply describe what they see. Her answer broke something inside me that anger never could. That night, for the first time since everything happened, I began wondering whether divorce was really the solution, or whether it was simply the loudest cry for help I had never learned to say out loud. And I still had no idea that my husband had been carrying a painful secret of his own. One that would completely change the way I judged everything that had happened between us. Looking back, what if the answer to a painful question was hidden inside a happy memory? After my daughter said, "You don't smile at each other anymore," I could not stop thinking about the past. That simple sentence echoed in my mind while I cleaned the kitchen, drove the children to school, and tried to continue our normal American routine. I kept asking myself a question that felt both painful and hopeful. How did two people who once laughed so easily become strangers sitting at the same dinner table? I decided to look back, not because I wanted to escape the present, but because I needed to remember who we had been before silence took over our home. I first met my husband at a small community event in California. I had recently moved there for work and still felt uncertain about my place in the United States. Everything seemed bigger, faster, and louder than what I was used to. At the event, I was standing near a table of homemade desserts, trying to decide whether to take a slice of pie, when a man beside me smiled and said, "You look like you're making a very important decision." I laughed because he was right. That was the first thing I noticed about him. He could make an ordinary moment feel warm and easy. We started talking about simple things, food, weather, our favorite places to visit, and the strange way American grocery stores seem to sell 20 different kinds of cereal. The conversation flowed naturally. According to relationship researchers, one of the strongest signs of early connection is the feeling that conversation does not require effort. That is exactly how it felt with him. I did not have to search for words. I did not have to pretend to be more interesting than I was. I could simply be myself. In the months that followed, we explored our new life together. We drove along the Pacific Coast Highway, visited small towns with colorful farmers markets, and spent evenings talking about our dreams. He taught me how to barbecue in the American style, and I taught him some of the traditions and foods from my own background. We were fascinated by each other's habits. He was surprised that I liked to make tea late at night. I was surprised that he could discuss baseball statistics for an entire hour with genuine excitement. Those small cultural differences felt charming then. They made our relationship feel like an adventure. When he proposed, we were standing near a quiet lake during a weekend trip. The air was cool, and the trees reflected on the water like a painting. He did not give a dramatic speech. He simply held my hands and said, "I want to build a life with you." I said yes before he even finished the sentence. At that moment, marriage did not feel like a legal contract or a social expectation. It felt like a promise to keep choosing each other, even when life became complicated. Our early years of marriage were filled with ordinary happiness. We rented a small apartment, worked hard, and celebrated tiny victories together. When we bought our first home in the United States, We painted the walls ourselves and laughed when we accidentally chose the wrong shade of blue for the living room. We did not have much money then, but we had excitement. Every new step felt like something we had achieved as a team. Then our children were born, and our world changed completely. Parenthood brought a new kind of love into our lives, but it also brought exhaustion, responsibility, and constant pressure. We learned how to survive on little sleep. We learned how to pack school lunches while answering work emails. We learned how to comfort a sick child at midnight and still wake up early for another busy day. Like many families in America, we became experts at managing schedules. But somewhere in that management, we slowly stopped nurturing our marriage. Looking back, I can see that the warning signs were small at first. We stopped having long conversations after dinner. We stopped planning little weekend outings just for ourselves. We stopped asking each other questions about dreams, fears, and feelings. Our communication became practical instead of personal. We were still partners in parenting and household responsibilities, but we were no longer deeply connected as husband and wife. Psychologists often describe this as emotional drift. It does not happen because love disappears overnight. It happens because attention slowly shifts away from the relationship. The relationship is still there, but it receives less care, less curiosity, and less tenderness. As I looked through old photos that evening, I realized something important. The man in those pictures was not a stranger. He was the same man sleeping on the couch downstairs. The woman smiling beside him was still me. The love that once connected us had not completely vanished. It had simply become buried under years of stress, routine, and unspoken emotions. That realization did not solve our problems, but it changed the way I saw them. If we had once built a strong and joyful life together, maybe there was still something worth saving. And for the first time since I said those terrible words, I began to wonder whether our marriage was ending, or whether we were finally being forced to confront the truth we had ignored for too long. What my heart really needed. What if the biggest problem in your marriage is not what you say, but what you never say? That question followed me everywhere after I looked through our old family photos. I had spent days blaming my husband for the distance between us, but for the first time, I wondered whether I had been hiding from my own feelings too. It is surprisingly easy to believe that another person is responsible for your unhappiness. It is much harder to admit that you have been silently carrying pain without ever explaining it. Every morning, I continued my routine. I prepared breakfast before sunrise, reminded the children to pack their school bags, answered work messages, folded laundry, cleaned the kitchen, paid bills, and smiled whenever someone asked how I was doing. My answer was always the same.
Ai fine.
The strange thing was that I had repeated those two words so many times that I almost believed them myself. According to psychologists, emotional exhaustion often develops gradually rather than suddenly. People become so focused on meeting everyone else's needs that they stop recognizing their own emotional limits. The body keeps working, but the heart quietly begins asking for help. Looking back, I realized I had ignored every warning sign. I was constantly tired, easily irritated, and secretly disappointed when my husband failed to notice how overwhelmed I felt. The problem was that I expected him to read emotions I had never spoken aloud. One afternoon, while waiting in my car outside my son's soccer practice, I watched other parents talking, laughing, and cheering for their children. A woman sitting nearby received a short text message from her husband. She smiled, laughed softly, and typed back immediately. I was not jealous of the message itself. I was jealous of the connection behind it. I opened my own phone and scrolled through weeks of conversations between my husband and me. Almost every message sounded the same. Can you pick up milk? Don't forget the dentist appointment. I'll be home late. The kids need new shoes. Hundreds of messages. Almost none of them asked, "How are you feeling?" Even more painful, I realized I had never asked him that question either. Scientists studying long-term relationships often explain that emotional intimacy depends on curiosity. Couples who continue asking each other meaningful questions usually remain more connected over time. Curiosity is one of love's quietest forms. When curiosity disappears, assumptions begin taking its place. I had assumed my husband no longer cared. Perhaps he had assumed I no longer needed comfort. Neither assumption was necessarily true. That evening, after the children went to bed, I sat alone on the back porch. The summer air was warm, and fireflies blinked across the yard. For the first time in months, I stopped thinking about everything my husband had failed to do. Instead, I asked myself a difficult question. If someone had asked me exactly what I needed for my marriage, could I have answered? The silence surprised me. I wanted appreciation, but I had never asked for it. I wanted affection, but I rarely reached for his hand anymore. I wanted deeper conversations, but whenever we had free time, I usually chose my phone or television because I felt too exhausted to talk. My heart wanted closeness, but my habits were quietly creating distance. Researchers call this emotional misalignment. Our intentions and our daily behaviors slowly begin moving in opposite directions. We still love someone, yet our actions accidentally communicate something completely different. That realization was uncomfortable because it meant I was not simply a victim of our marriage problems. I was also part of the story. That truth did not erase my husband's mistakes. It simply reminded me that healing rarely begins with blaming another person. It begins with understanding yourself. As I sat there thinking, I remembered something my grandmother once told me many years ago. People often shout when what they truly need is to be heard. I finally understood what she meant. When I said, I want a divorce, I was not really asking to end my marriage. I was asking someone to notice the invisible weight I had been carrying for years. My anger had been speaking the language that my sadness never learned. Modern psychology supports this idea. Many therapists explain that anger is frequently a secondary emotion. Beneath anger often lives fear, loneliness, disappointment, rejection, or emotional exhaustion. We show anger because it feels stronger than admitting we are hurting. That description fit me perfectly. I had not been fighting against my husband. I had been fighting against the growing feeling of becoming invisible inside my own life. As that realization settled into my heart, I felt something unexpected. Not relief, not happiness, hope. Small, quiet hope. Because if my words had never reflected what I truly wanted, perhaps our story was not over after all. Perhaps the sentence that almost ended our marriage was actually the painful beginning of learning how to tell each other the truth. But I still had no idea whether my husband was willing to take that journey with me, or whether he had already made a decision that would change our family forever. Learning to listen again. Have you ever wondered why two people can hear every word the other person says, yet completely miss what they actually mean? That question stayed with me for days after I realized my heart had been asking for connection instead of separation. But understanding the problem and changing it were two completely different things. I still did not know whether my husband wanted to save our marriage. The silence between us remained, but it no longer felt empty. It felt as if both of us were standing on opposite sides of a bridge, waiting to see who would take the first step. Then something happened that neither of us had planned. One quiet Sunday afternoon, while the children were visiting a friend's house, my husband walked into the living room carrying 2 cups of coffee. He placed one in front of me and simply said, "Can we talk?" Those 3 words sounded almost unfamiliar. Not because they were complicated, but because we had avoided them for so long. I nodded without speaking. My heart was beating faster than I wanted to admit. Part of me expected another argument. Another part hoped this conversation might finally become the beginning of something different. For a few minutes, neither of us spoke. We looked out the window at the trees moving gently in the summer breeze. Then my husband quietly said something I never expected to hear. When you said you wanted a divorce, I wasn't angry. I was terrified because I realized I hadn't noticed how unhappy you had become. His voice was calm, but I could hear sadness underneath every sentence. For the first time in months, I stopped preparing my next response while he was talking. Instead, I simply listened. Relationship experts often explain that most people do not listen to understand. They listen to reply. That single idea changed the way I heard every word that afternoon. My husband admitted he had been overwhelmed by work, worried about providing for our family, and afraid that every conversation would turn into another disagreement. Instead of sharing those fears, he buried himself deeper in his job, believing that working harder was another way of loving us. I had interpreted his long hours as emotional distance. He had believed they were acts of responsibility. Neither of us had been completely wrong. Neither of us had been completely right. We had simply been speaking different emotional languages. Then it was my turn. I took a deep breath and confessed something I had never said out loud. I didn't want a different husband, I whispered. I wanted to feel like I still mattered to the man I married. The room became silent again, but this silence felt different. It was no longer cold. It was thoughtful. Scientists studying communication describe this moment as emotional validation. When someone feels genuinely heard without immediate judgment or interruption, the brain naturally lowers its stress response, making honest conversation easier. Looking back, I realized we had spent years solving practical problems while ignoring emotional ones. We knew how to organize family schedules, manage finances, and raise children, but we had forgotten how to ask simple questions like, "How was your day?" Or, "What are you worried about lately?" Sometimes the smallest conversations prevent the biggest disasters. That afternoon, we made one surprisingly simple agreement. Every evening after the children went to bed, we would spend just 20 minutes talking without phones, television, laptops, or distractions. No discussions about bills. No conversations about chores. No complaints about work. Just 20 minutes to ask questions, listen carefully, and remember who we were beyond being parents and employees. At first, those conversations felt awkward. We had become so accustomed to discussing responsibilities that talking about ourselves almost felt like meeting strangers. But slowly, something unexpected happened. We laughed again. We remembered old stories we had forgotten. We discovered new dreams that neither of us knew the other still had. Researchers often call this rebuilding emotional intimacy through consistent connection. It is not one grand romantic gesture that transforms a relationship. It is hundreds of ordinary moments repeated with genuine attention. One evening, my husband reached across the table and held my hand while I was speaking. It lasted only a few seconds, yet it meant more than an expensive gift ever could. That simple touch reminded me of the young couple we had once been, standing beside a quiet lake promising to build a life together. Love, I was beginning to understand, does not usually disappear. It becomes buried beneath stress, routine, pride, and unspoken fears. The good news is that what becomes buried can sometimes be uncovered. Week by week, our home slowly began to sound different. The children laughed more during dinner. Music returned to the kitchen while we cooked together. Even the walls seemed warmer somehow. Nothing about our lives had become easier. We still worked hard. We still faced bills, deadlines, and parenting challenges. But we were finally carrying those burdens together instead of carrying them alone. I believed we were healing. I believed the worst was finally behind us. But life has a surprising way of testing hope just when it begins to grow. A single unexpected phone call only a few days later would challenge everything we had rebuilt and force us to discover whether our marriage had truly become stronger or whether it was still one difficult moment away from falling apart forever. A different kind of love. Have you ever noticed that life rarely asks whether your marriage is ready before it sends the next challenge? Just when I believed my husband and I were finally finding our way back to each other, my phone rang on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. The number on the screen belonged to his office. My heart immediately raced. I answered, expecting an ordinary message. But instead I heard a calm voice explaining that my husband had suddenly become dizzy during an important meeting. It was not life-threatening, they assured me, but they had taken him to a nearby hospital for observation. I grabbed my keys without thinking. As I drove through the busy streets, every traffic light seemed impossibly slow. Just a few weeks earlier, I had been wondering whether I wanted to leave this man forever. Now my only prayer was that he would be waiting for me when I arrived. Funny how fear has a way of revealing what love has been trying to say all along. When I entered his hospital room, he smiled the moment he saw me. It was a tired smile, but it was real. "I'm okay," he whispered before I could ask anything. I laughed and cried at the same time, something I had not done in years. The doctor explained that severe stress, lack of sleep, and constant pressure had finally caught up with him. Fortunately, it was not a heart attack. His body had simply reached its limit and refused to keep pretending everything was fine. As the doctor spoke, I felt an uncomfortable truth settle into my heart. I had spent months believing I was the only exhausted person in our marriage. I never stopped to wonder whether my husband had been carrying invisible burdens too. According to health researchers, chronic stress affects not only emotional well-being, but also physical health. Long working hours, financial responsibility, poor sleep, and emotional suppression can quietly increase the risk of anxiety, high blood pressure, and burnout. Listening to the doctor felt strangely familiar. He was describing my husband, but in many ways he was describing both of us. We had been surviving instead of living. Later that evening, after the children visited him with handmade cards and cheerful hugs, the hospital room became quiet. My husband looked out the window for a long moment before speaking. "I thought working harder would protect our family," he said softly. "I didn't realize I was disappearing while trying to provide for all of you." His words stayed with me because they reflected something I had never fully understood. Love does not always look the way we expect. Sometimes one person shows love through words and affection. Another shows love by working overtime, fixing broken appliances, paying bills on time, and quietly carrying responsibility. The problem begins when two people speak different love languages, but expect the other person to automatically understand them. Psychologists often explain that lasting relationships depend less on finding the perfect partner and more on learning how your partner experiences love, stress, fear, and security. We had spent years expressing love in completely different ways without translating it for each other. I wanted conversations. He offered stability. I wanted emotional closeness. He believed financial security was the greatest expression of care. Neither approach was wrong, but neither was complete. Before leaving the hospital, I reached for his hand and smiled. "When you come home," I said, "let's stop trying to build the perfect family. Let's build a peaceful one." He squeezed my hand gently and nodded. It was a small moment, yet somehow it felt larger than every argument we had ever had. Over the next several weeks, our home slowly changed in ways that surprised all of us. My husband reduced his overtime whenever possible. We began eating dinner together more consistently. We started taking evening walks around our neighborhood after the children finished their homework. Those walks became our favorite habit. Sometimes we talked about serious things. Sometimes we laughed about something completely unimportant. Sometimes we simply walked side by side, without speaking at all. But even our silence felt different now. It no longer created distance. It created peace. Researchers often emphasize that couples who regularly share small positive experiences strengthen emotional resilience over time. Those simple routines become protective memories that help relationships survive future challenges. I could feel that happening to us. Even the children noticed the difference. One evening, my daughter smiled during dinner and quietly said, "You two laugh a lot more now." My husband and I looked at each other and laughed again. That innocent observation meant more than she could possibly understand. It reminded us that healing inside a marriage never affects only two people. It changes the atmosphere of an entire family. Looking back, I realized I had misunderstood love for many years. I believed love was something you felt. Now I was beginning to understand that love is also something you practice. It is choosing patience when frustration feels easier. It is choosing curiosity instead of assumptions. It is choosing kindness before pride. Most importantly, it is choosing the same person again and again, even after disappointment, misunderstanding, and tears. I thought we had finally learned the lesson our marriage had been trying to teach us. But life still had one final test waiting around the corner. And the decision we would soon face would prove whether our second chance was truly strong enough to last for the rest of our lives. The unexpected turning point. What if the moment that almost destroyed your family became the very moment that saved it? Just when I thought my husband and I had finally learned how to communicate again, life placed one more unexpected test in front of us. It did not arrive with loud arguments or dramatic words. It arrived quietly, wrapped inside a simple white envelope that our oldest son carried home from school. At first, I thought it was another permission slip for a field trip or a reminder about an upcoming parent meeting. Instead, it was an assignment called My Family, My Heroes. Every student had been asked to write about the people they admired most. That evening, after dinner, our son shyly asked if he could read his essay out loud before submitting it. My husband and I smiled and nodded. We expected a sweet story about family vacations, birthdays, or funny memories. We were completely unprepared for what we were about to hear. Our son took a deep breath and began reading. My heroes are my mom and dad because they never stopped trying, even when life became difficult. I felt my chest tighten immediately. He continued reading in a calm voice. Last year, I thought my family might fall apart. I didn't know everything that happened, but I knew something was wrong because our house became very quiet. I used to wonder if my parents would still be together when I woke up one morning. My husband slowly lowered his eyes toward the floor. Neither of us interrupted. Our son continued. Then something changed. They started talking again. They smiled again. We started eating dinner together more often. I don't think heroes are people who never make mistakes. I think heroes are people who choose not to give up. By the time he finished, nobody spoke for several seconds. My daughter quietly wiped tears from her eyes without saying a word. My husband reached across the table and gently held my hand. That simple essay accomplished what months of conversations could not. It allowed us to see our marriage through the eyes of our children. According to family psychologists, children develop emotional security not because their parents are perfect, but because they consistently witness repair after conflict. Disagreements themselves are not usually what frighten children most. Unresolved silence, emotional distance, and uncertainty create far deeper anxiety. Our children had quietly carried fears we never intended to give them. Yet they had also witnessed something valuable: two imperfect adults choosing healing instead of surrender. Later that night, after the children were asleep, my husband and I sat together on the back porch beneath a sky filled with stars. Neither of us reached for our phones. Neither of us rushed to fill the silence. Finally, he spoke. "I thought protecting this family meant earning more money," he admitted softly. "Now I realize protecting this family also means protecting us." I smiled through tears because, for the first time in years, we were speaking the same emotional language. I answered quietly, and I thought asking for help made me weak. I was wrong too. We both laughed gently at how much time we had wasted pretending to be strong instead of simply being honest. Researchers studying long-term marriages often describe vulnerability as one of the strongest predictors of lasting intimacy. When two people stop competing over who is right and begin revealing what truly hurts, trust slowly begins to grow again. Looking back, I realized our marriage had never been saved by one dramatic conversation or one romantic gesture. It had been rebuilt through dozens of ordinary moments: shared coffee, evening walks, patient listening, unexpected apologies, quiet forgiveness, and the willingness to stay present when leaving would have been easier. Those small choices became the strongest foundation we had ever built. A few weeks later, our family took a weekend trip to the mountains. The children ran ahead along a hiking trail while my husband and I walked behind them, holding hands almost without thinking. The autumn air was cool, and colorful leaves covered the path beneath our feet. At one point, we stopped at a scenic overlook where we could see miles of forest stretching toward the horizon. My husband looked at me, smiled, and asked a question that immediately took me back to the night everything almost ended. "If I could go back to that rainy evening," he said quietly, "would you still say those words?" I looked out across the mountains before answering. "Maybe," I whispered honestly, because those words finally forced us to hear everything we had been too afraid to say. He nodded slowly, understanding exactly what I meant. Sometimes the sentence that sounds like the ending of a story is actually the painful beginning of a better chapter. But neither of us realized that one final conversation still awaited us at home, a conversation that would answer the question everyone had silently been asking since the very first moment I said, "I want a divorce." Did I truly mean it? Or was love quietly waiting behind those heartbreaking words all along? Did I really mean it? What if the most important answer in your life was not hidden inside the words you spoke, but inside the tears you tried to hide? Ever since that rainy evening when I whispered, "I want a divorce," one question had followed me everywhere. My husband had never asked it directly. My children had never dared to ask it. Even I avoided answering it because I was afraid of what the truth might reveal. Did I really mean those words? Or had they simply become the loudest expression of years of silent pain? A few days after our family trip to the mountains, my husband surprised me with an invitation. "Can we go back to the lake where I proposed?" he asked. I smiled quietly and agreed. The drive felt strangely familiar. The same winding roads, the same peaceful trees, the same calm water waiting for us. But this time, we were not two young people dreaming about the future. We were two imperfect adults carrying years of mistakes, disappointments, forgiveness, and hope. As we stood beside the lake, neither of us rushed to speak. The gentle sound of the water seemed to say everything that words could not. Finally, my husband turned toward me and asked the question I had been expecting for weeks. "When you said you wanted a divorce," he asked softly, "did you truly want to leave me?" I closed my eyes for a moment, because I wanted my answer to be completely honest. According to psychologists, our first emotional reaction is not always the same as our deepest truth. Strong emotions often speak before wisdom has a chance to catch up. Looking back, I finally understood exactly what had happened inside me that rainy night. I opened my eyes and quietly answered, "No." I wanted the loneliness to end. I wanted the silence to end. I wanted the feeling of disappearing to end. I just didn't know how to ask for that. My husband did not interrupt. He simply listened. That alone felt different from the life we had been living before. I continued speaking. Divorce was never my dream. Feeling loved was. The sentence surprised even me because I had never expressed it so clearly before. Tears slowly filled my husband's eyes. "I thought I was loving you every day," he admitted. "I just kept speaking a language you could no longer hear." At that moment, something inside both of us finally became clear. We had never stopped loving each other. We had stopped translating love into forms the other person could understand. Researchers studying successful long-term marriages often explain that emotional connection depends less on intention and more on perception. It is not enough to love someone. They must also be able to feel loved. That difference may sound small, but it changes everything. We spent the next hour talking more honestly than we had in many years. We spoke about our fears of growing older. We spoke about raising children while trying to protect our marriage. We admitted the moments when pride had become stronger than vulnerability. We even laughed at some of our misunderstandings because they seemed almost unbelievable now. One memory made us both smile. I confessed that every time he stayed late at work, I imagined he preferred being at the office instead of coming home. He laughed gently and shook his head. "Most nights," he said, "I stayed late because I was worried about paying for the kids' college one day." We looked at each other in complete silence. How many years had we wasted creating stories inside our own minds instead of simply asking one honest question? Scientists often call this negative assumption bias. When communication disappears, the brain naturally fills missing information with fear rather than facts. That realization explained so many unnecessary arguments we had carried through the years. Before leaving the lake, my husband reached into his jacket pocket. For one terrifying second, I wondered if he had brought divorce papers after all. Instead, he pulled out a small folded piece of paper. It was old, slightly faded, and carefully protected inside a clear plastic sleeve. "Do you recognize this?" he asked. I unfolded it slowly. It was the short handwritten note I had secretly placed inside his lunchbox during our first year of marriage. It simply read, "No matter how difficult life becomes, let's always find our way back to each other." I stared at the note in complete disbelief. He had carried it in his wallet for more than 20 years. My hands began trembling. "I never stopped believing these words," he whispered, "even on the night you asked for a divorce." At that moment, every wall I had built around my heart completely disappeared. I stepped forward, wrapped my arms around him, and cried without embarrassment. Those tears were different from the ones I had cried months earlier. Those tears did not come from hopelessness. They came from finally feeling understood. As we stood beside the quiet lake where our story had once begun, I finally answered the question that had shaped this entire journey. Did I really mean it when I said, "I want a divorce"?
No.
I meant, please don't let us lose each other. And sometimes, the heart hides its deepest truth inside the very words that sound most frightening. We left the lake holding hands, believing the hardest chapter was finally behind us. But the greatest lesson of our marriage was still waiting to be discovered. And it would change not only our future, but the future of our entire family forever. choosing us again. What if the strongest marriages are not the ones that never break, but the ones brave enough to rebuild? That question stayed in my heart long after we left the quiet lake where I finally admitted the truth. I had never truly wanted a divorce. I had wanted to find my way back to the man I had fallen in love with. As we drove home through the peaceful countryside, neither of us talked very much. We did not need to. For the first time in years, silence no longer felt like punishment. It felt like peace. The kind of peace that comes only after two people stop trying to win arguments and begin trying to understand each other. I looked out the window as the evening sun painted the sky with soft shades of orange and gold. Everything outside looked familiar, yet somehow different. Then I realized nothing around me had actually changed. The roads were the same. The trees were the same. Our destination was the same. The only thing that had changed was the way I was looking at my life. Researchers often describe gratitude as one of the most powerful habits for improving long-term relationships. Gratitude does not erase problems, but it changes what your mind notices first. Instead of constantly searching for what was missing, I slowly began noticing what had quietly remained all along. When we arrived home, our children were waiting at the front door. My daughter ran toward us with a huge smile. "You're holding hands again," she shouted before hugging both of us at the same time. My husband laughed, and I laughed with him. Such a small observation from a child, yet it reminded me that children pay attention to love in ways adults often forget. They notice smiles, eye contact, gentle voices, and little moments of kindness. They may never remember the exact words our parents speak, but they never forget how home makes them feel. That evening, instead of watching television, we cooked dinner together as a family. My son chopped vegetables while my daughter proudly mixed the salad. My husband accidentally dropped a spoon on the floor, and everyone burst into laughter. Months earlier, that tiny mistake might have irritated me because I was already emotionally exhausted. Now it simply became another funny family memory. I finally understood that joy rarely returns through dramatic miracles. It quietly returns through ordinary moments that people choose not to rush past. During the following weeks, my husband and I made several promises to each other. We promised never to let busy schedules replace meaningful conversations again. We promised to ask difficult questions before making painful assumptions. We promised to protect our marriage with the same energy we use to protect our careers, finances, and daily responsibilities. Relationship experts often explain that healthy marriages depend on intentional habits rather than perfect compatibility. Love grows where attention grows. We decided to give our attention back to each other. One evening, while organizing old boxes in the garage, we found a notebook from our first year of marriage. Inside were handwritten lists of dreams we had created together. Some had already come true. We had bought our first home. We had raised wonderful children. We had built a safe and loving life in America. But many dreams had been forgotten completely. We had once planned to travel across several national parks after retirement. We wanted to learn ballroom dancing, just for fun. We even wrote down a goal to volunteer together in our community once the children became older. Reading those pages reminded us that marriage is not only about surviving responsibilities. It is also about continuing to dream together. Psychologists often explain that couples who share future goals tend to experience stronger emotional bonds because they continue seeing themselves as teammates instead of simply roommates. That night, we added new dreams to the notebook. None of them were expensive or extraordinary. We wanted more family picnics, more evening walks, more birthdays celebrated without checking our phones every few minutes. More honest conversations. More laughter filling the kitchen. More hugs without waiting for special occasions. Those simple dreams suddenly felt more valuable than anything money could buy. A few months later, we celebrated our wedding anniversary. Instead of choosing a luxury restaurant or an expensive vacation, we returned to the small neighborhood cafe where we had enjoyed coffee during our first months together. As we sat across from each other, my husband smiled and asked, "If you could change one thing about our marriage, what would it be?" I thought carefully before answering. "I wouldn't erase our hardest days," I finally said. "Without them, we would never have learned how precious ordinary days really are." He reached across the table and gently squeezed my hand. "Then let's never waste another ordinary day," he replied. In that quiet moment, I realized choosing each other was never something we had done only once on our wedding day. It was a decision we would continue making every morning we woke up together. Love was no longer just a feeling that came naturally. It had become a daily choice built through patience, honesty, forgiveness, kindness, and hope. Looking back, I could finally see that the words, "I want a divorce," had never been the ending of our story. They had become the painful beginning of a marriage that was finally honest enough to survive. And although our journey had transformed our family forever, one final lesson still remained, a lesson that would completely redefine what a happy ending truly means. Our happy ending. What if a happy ending is not the moment when life becomes perfect, but the moment when you finally stop running away from the people you love? If someone had told me 1 year earlier that the words, "I want a divorce," would eventually make our marriage stronger, I would have never believed them. At that time, I thought our story was ending. I believed too much had already been broken. I believed silence had lasted too long. I believed love had quietly disappeared while we were busy building careers, raising children, paying bills, and surviving another ordinary week in America. I was wrong. Love had never disappeared. It had simply been waiting beneath years of exhaustion, pride, fear, and misunderstandings. Looking back now, I understand something I wish I had learned much earlier. Marriage is not protected by perfect people. It is protected by imperfect people who continue choosing each other after disappointment. Every morning, we now begin our day differently. Before anyone checks emails or rushes toward another busy schedule, my husband and I sit together for a few quiet minutes with a cup of coffee. Sometimes we talk about important things. Sometimes we simply watch the sunrise through the kitchen window without saying much at all. Those peaceful mornings have become our daily reminder that relationships are strengthened one ordinary moment at a time. Scientists who study happiness consistently find that long-term life satisfaction rarely comes from dramatic events. Instead, it grows through repeated experiences of connection, gratitude, shared purpose, and emotional safety. Looking around my home today, I finally understand why. The greatest moments of my life are no longer the expensive vacations or the biggest celebrations. They are the little things I once overlooked. My daughter laughing while helping prepare dinner. My son asking his father for advice before making an important decision. My husband reaching for my hand during an evening walk without even realizing he is doing it. Those tiny moments quietly became the foundation of our family's happiness. A few months after our anniversary, our children surprised us with a framed photograph they had secretly printed. It showed our entire family standing together during that mountain trip, smiling naturally beneath the autumn trees. At the bottom of the frame, they had written one simple sentence: "Home is where people keep choosing each other." I stared at those words for a long time because they captured everything our journey had taught us. Home is not a building. It is not a city. It is not even a country. Home is the place where forgiveness is stronger than pride, where listening becomes more important than winning, and where love is practiced every single day instead of being assumed. Relationship psychologists often explain that resilience is not the absence of conflict. It is the ability to recover together after conflict. That idea completely changed the way I define success in marriage. We still disagree sometimes. We still have stressful days. We still become tired, impatient, or worried about the future. The difference is that we no longer treat each other as opponents. We remember that the real challenge is never husband versus wife. It is both of us standing side by side against the problem itself. That simple change transformed everything. Sometimes people ask me the same question that my husband asked beside the lake. Do you regret saying, "I want a divorce"? My answer always surprises them. I regret waiting so long before telling the truth about how lonely I had become. I regret believing that being strong meant staying silent. I regret expecting my husband to understand feelings I had never shared. But I do not regret the journey that followed because it forced both of us to become the kind of partners we should have been from the beginning. If you are listening to my story today while feeling frustrated, exhausted, misunderstood, or ready to give up, I hope you remember this. One difficult conversation does not have to become the end of your story. Sometimes it becomes the first honest chapter of a much better one. Ask the question you have been avoiding. Listen before defending yourself. Be curious before making assumptions. Tell the people you love what your heart actually needs instead of expecting them to guess. Those small choices may seem ordinary, but ordinary choices create extraordinary lives. As for me, I never truly wanted a divorce. What I truly wanted was to find my way back to the man who once made me laugh over a slice of pie. The father who quietly carried our family through difficult seasons, and the partner who never stopped believing in us, even when I had almost stopped believing myself. Today, when we walk hand in hand through our neighborhood and watch our children growing into kind, confident young adults, I understand that love is not something you find once. Love is something you keep building, protecting, repairing, and choosing for the rest of your life. And perhaps that is the happiest ending anyone could ever hope for. Because the strongest families are not the ones without scars. They are the ones who transform those scars into reminders that they survived together.